Hey everyone. A few years back, I made a video called What is Kundalini? And that became my second most popular video ever. Currently has about 35,000 views. And this is a follow-up to that video, going a little further and deeper into the topic. So in that video, I looked at some sources for Kundalini in the classical period of Tantra. So that's the period from like 800 to 1100 in our calendar. But I didn't attempt to explain Kundalini Yoga, nor did I look at the early modern sources from around 1500 to 1800 in our calendar, which are important for understanding the evolution of the teachings on Kundalini into the modern period. So here I'll rectify that, however briefly, and this will certainly help deepen your understanding of Kundalini based on the primary sources written in Sanskrit. Now, you may not know that primary sources continued to be composed in the Sanskrit language all the way up to, well, the 20th century, as we'll see. So this is a living tradition that never died out and flourished in different parts of India, especially Kashmir. Of course, Kashmir came under Muslim domination beginning in the early 1300s, and yet the tradition continued to grow organically in that context, though it also contracted. That is to say, there was less productivity, certainly, but still it continued, as we'll see. Now, we don't find the phrase Kundalini Yoga in the classical sources from 1,000 years ago, but we do find it in early modern sources. And one of these is the unpublished text, Remembrance of the Principle of Mortality, or Remembrance of the Reality of Mortality, Mriti Tattva Anusmarana in Sanskrit. And this text was composed around 1550 or 600 in our calendar, in Kashmir. And this text, which was much copied and studied in early modern Kashmir, teaches rituals around death and dying, and also describes various possible after-death scenarios, none of them permanent. Of course, that's the big difference in Western and Eastern traditions. In Eastern traditions, there are no afterlife scenarios that are permanent. There are certainly hell realms and heavenly realms that are described in the Eastern sources, both Buddhist and Hindu, but none of them are permanent destinations. Anyway, when teaching how to avoid unpleasant afterlife experiences, this text explains that liberation from suffering, including such undesirable after-death states, can be attained through three methods. So whether we're talking about liberation in this life or avoidance of suffering after death, the same three methods apply according to this text, which is, by the way, drawing on the earlier tradition, organically building on the earlier tradition. It's not an independent treatise. Okay, the first method is correctly done ritual practice that, if successful, can dissolve karma to a certain extent. So this is the path of kriya, or ritual. And the second method is spiritual realization through insight, jnana. And the third method is yoga. And the type of yoga envisaged here is precisely a Kundalini yoga. Now, unfortunately, not much detail of this is given, but the teaching is nonetheless intriguing, and some detail is given. Here's a translation of the relevant passage from this text. And this translation is done by myself with some ideas contributed by my Sanskrit students. Okay, so from the Mriti Tattva Anusmarana, Remembrance of the Reality of Mortality, Chapter 9. One should restrain and focus the vital energy, the prana. Through this method, cast out the tainted prana or the sullied wind from the right channel, the Pingala Nadi, through an upward exhale. Then one should fill it, the right channel, with purified wind, prana, from the left channel, the lunar Ida channel. Subsequently, one should retain the prana in the central channel in the correct way. Finally, one should perform the uchara of the pranava. One should perform the uchara of the pranava, literally the enunciation of the cosmic hum or the cosmic roar. And this is a reference to the mantra Om, or one of its tantric variations, such as Haum. And uchara, which I just translated as enunciation, means much more than enunciation. It also means elevation, because you are raising the bija mantra through the central channel in a very specific technique that I taught in an earlier YouTube video on the practice of uchara. And uchara was, and still is for some people, one of the central tantric practices. Back in the day, it was one of the few practices that all tantric practitioners engaged in. Okay, so the passage continues as follows. One must firmly join oneself to yoga by means of filling, retaining, and exhaling repeatedly until awakening of the Kundalini occurs. So here, pranayama type practice is obviously suggested, filling the lungs, filling the channels, retaining the prana, and exhaling it up the central channel until awakening of the Kundalini occurs. The passage continues. Reaching and passing beyond the 6 chakras in sequence, beginning from Muladhara, as also the great elements situated within 5 of them, beginning with earth. One will, as a result, attain their respective siddhis. Then, upon reaching the aperture of space in the crown of the head, one will attain oneness with Shiva, God or cosmic consciousness, in accordance with the rite. Then one should drink the extraordinary immortal nectar, Amrita, produced by union with him. Having drunk that nectar, one ultimately becomes Shiva embodied in very little time. Okay, so it's a very suggestive passage. Clearly, this Kundalini Yoga bears some resemblance to the methods taught under the same name or similar names in Hatha Yoga sources. And clearly, it does not bear much resemblance to what is taught under the name of Kundalini Yoga in modern yoga studios around the world. That's a different thing. It's a 20th century creation. So, how much more can I explain this? Not much in the context of a video. Explanation of this practice is supposed to traditionally be given in a live practice environment with interaction between student and teacher. However, I will say that on my platform, Tantra Illuminated educational platform, I do there share a practice that does exactly what this passage is talking about in terms of purifying the channels by moving prana from the left to the right, just as the first part of the passage describes. As I mentioned, the uchara explanation, that's public here on YouTube. And as for the rest, yeah, this needs to be further expanded in a live practice environment. But suffice to say that it's interesting that that we see here the implication of a chakra system very similar to the one in modern usage today. And that's important because in my most popular blog post on the chakras that many of you have read, some people got the idea that I was saying that the modern chakra system is entirely a Western fabrication, and that's not true at all. It's well, it's mostly a Western fabrication, but based on a real chakra system from the original tradition that does indeed have 6 chakras plus a sahasrara in the crown of the head, and assimilates the 5 great elements of earth, water, fire, wind, and space to 5 of the chakras. And that's indeed what we see in the modern chakra system, where there's a sort of confusion that's arisen between the elements and their mantras and the chakras themselves, as I get into in that blog post. Okay, so that's the translation from this 16th century text. Now I'd like to compare that to a passage found in another text called the Siddha Siddhanta Padhati. And this was composed in South India around the year 1700, probably. So again, you can see that the tradition was still vital here in the early modern period and continuing to develop. So here's that passage. By means of the awakening of the central goddess power, Madhya Shakti, as a result of the compression of the lower goddess power, and by means of the descent of the upper goddess power, the supreme level of realization or liberation is attained. So here in this source, actually 3 aspects of Kundalini are envisioned: one in the base, one in the center, and one in the head. And the Kundalini in the head is supposed to flow down towards the heart, and the one in the base is supposed to flow up, and they meet in the heart. And there's certain techniques to do this, especially the lower energy needs to be sort of pumped up towards the heart with, for example, mula bandha and breath control, whereas the upper energy is often thought to flow down spontaneously as an act of grace. And I did talk about this in the earlier Kundalini video as well. Okay, the text continues. She is only one, but by being classified as central, upper, and lower, she has 3 names. Contracting the lower goddess power is perfected by locking the base support, locking the Muladhara, from which this universe, moving and unmoving, conscious and unconscious, is produced. So this association of the Muladhara with the ground of being of the entire universe. The base support, the text says, is well known as the source of consciousness. She who is always inherently able to hold in the middle of her light the individual self is celebrated as the central goddess manifestation of Kundalini. The notion that the jiva, or individual self or soul, is here in the heart center, and Kundalini holds it in the middle of her light, it says. The supremely subtle Kundalini, the central goddess whose own form is consciousness, is to be awoken when she is in her own natural state by yogis who have learnt how to do so from the mouth of a true guru. Now the descent of the upper goddess power is taught. She whose nature is to reveal and point to various objects by means of self-perception is called the upper goddess power. Her descent is not merely the extinction of the fallacy that one's true nature is twofold. On the contrary, it happens because of the indivisibility of one's own true nature. The great adept yogis attain the supreme level by means of the descent of the upper goddess. Translation by James Mallinson. See the book Roots of Yoga, pages 216 to 18. Now, this again confirms what I was talking about in that earlier Kundalini video. And it's interesting that this phrase is used. Her descent is not merely the extinction of the fallacy that one's true nature is twofold. The extinction of the fallacy, in other words, that you have a higher self and a lower self. That's a really interesting point that gets worked in here. Now, notice that this text represents a tantric tradition not much influenced by developments in Hatha Yoga, which exclusively envisioned a single Kundalini, which always moves upward from the base of the body to the crown. The Siddhasiddhanta Padati, like a number of other earlier texts, has a more nuanced version of things, which one could argue better matches the varieties of spontaneous experiences of Kundalini described by modern practitioners. Finally, let's compare this passage I just read with a 20th century passage written in Sanskrit by Swami Lakshmanju, the last living Trika guru of Kashmir, who lived from 1907 to 1991. And this text that Lakshmanju composed also teaches 3 forms of Kundalini, drawing on the work of Abhinavagupta, who lived 1,000 years ago. And these 3 forms of Kundalini here are called Shakti Kundalini, the lower one, Prana Kundalini, the middle one, and Para Kundalini, the higher one, in terms of their localization in the body, not that they can truly be localized. Now, as far as I know, Swami Lakshmanju did not know the Siddhasiddhanta Padati, which was composed in South India. And this may indicate that the teaching on the triple Kundalini was widespread in various forms at one time. Okay, the following is translated from Swami Lakshmanju's original Sanskrit writing, which is called the Kundalini Vijnana Rahasya, the secret of the wisdom of Kundalini. Kundalini is the power which manifests the universe. She causes the 6 chakras to vibrate, arousing in awareness the sweet resonance produced by her passage. The term Kundalini refers to Shiva's power of emission, Visarga Shakti, which, inasmuch as it is universal, is identical with I-ness in its fullest expansion. The nature of Shakti Kundalini is described in the Tantra Sadbhava as follows. The ultimate and subtle power rests introverted, enveloping, like a sleeping serpent, the subjective center of awareness in the heart. Hridaya Bindu, the Bindu of the heart. The same goddess, Shakti Kundalini, has been described in the Tantra Loka, chapter 3. This power is the light of all things, endowed with emission. It is the Kundalini of power, the Kundalini of prana, and the supreme Kundalini at the crown of the head. She is also called the sky of Shiva and the abode of the self. So we see, by the way, a little bit of contradiction here in the sense that some sources situate that Shakti Kundalini lower down near the navel, and some like Swami Lakshmanju just described, have it in the heart. But notice that nowhere here is the base of the spine mentioned. The pelvic floor is not mentioned either. That notion is found more in Hatha Yoga texts than tantric ones. Okay. The text continues. The Kaula yogi also realizes this Shakti Kundalini as Kama Tattva, the essence of desire, through the contemplation of the power of desire during the secret sexual rite, at that moment of immersion, which is the co-penetration of Siddha and Yogini. So co-penetration, meaning the Siddha and Yogini, the male and female practitioners, actually are penetrating each other on the energetic level. The master Vatulanatha has also mentioned this Shakti Kundalini in the following sutra. Through the co-penetration of the Siddha and Yogini, the great celebratory unification arises. That's Sutra 5. The text continues. If a Kaula yogin establishes himself or herself therein, even for an instant, she or he experiences through the melting away of the duality of Shiva and Shakti as subject and object of awareness, an equilibrium, which is the supreme fusion in identity of the two. Thus, it should be clearly understood that only the Kaula yogin who experiences the state of Shakti Kundalini within the great celebratory unification of the co-penetration of Siddha and Yogini during the secret sexual rite is entitled to undertake it, to that rite, and nobody else. Therefore, none but those of the highest spiritual development who are fully established in the recognition of their all-inclusive identity are qualified for this secret rite, the source of the ultimate penetration and immersion, samavesha. Okay, so Swami Lakshmanju has described the Shakti Kundalini, which, whether it's more associated with the heart center or the low belly, it is associated with sexual energy in either case. Now I shall explain the nature of Prana Kundalini. The power of emission, its nature the blissful aesthetic relish, is described in our revealed texts as Prana Kundalini when it cognizes emission's emergence within its own identity. That same power of consciousness in its Prana Kundalini aspect is experienced by Kaula yogins flashing forth in that reality which is the first instant of ejaculation, visarga, in a triple meaning here. Visarga can mean the exhale of breath and the emission or arising of phenomenal experience of any kind. The text goes on, but here I shall add something on the basis of my own understanding. That's Swami Lakshmanju speaking. The stanzas on pulsation say, taking their stand on that thought-free center, both moon and sun, inhale and exhale, object and cognition, dissolve into the path of Sushumna and leave behind the sphere of Brahma, the objective world, rising beyond it. Then, in that great void within which sun and moon have utterly dissolved, the unaware remains as if immersed in a dreamless sleep, but the awareness of one who is awake remains unshrouded. Unquote. Swami Lakshmanju goes on. When, in the manner described in these verses, a Shaiva yogin, not allowing his awareness to slacken even for a moment, contemplating his identity with Shiva, draws near to the state of penetration and immersion, samavesha. Then, by virtue of his unbroken self-awareness, both his outgoing and ingoing breaths dissolve into the path of Shushumna. As soon as this happens, his vital energy, prana shakti, descends to the perineal center at the pelvic floor, Muladhara. Then, in radiant expansion, it flows up from there through the central channel, and as it does, the yogin experiences the state of prana kundalini. There are here two possible ways for yogis. The first is as follows. For some, when the outgoing and ingoing breaths dissolve into the central channel, they first turn downwards, and having broken through the lambika center, producing a sound like the roar one hears when one partially blocks one's ears with one's fingers, penetrate the perineal center. First, the yogin experiences this center spinning at great speed and emitting the sound I have described. Then the vital energy ascends therefrom and flowing up through the central channel pierces the second chakra, which is located in this system in the region of the navel, so that it too begins to revolve and resonate. At this stage, the yogin experiences both centers spinning simultaneously, the one in the pelvic floor and the one in or near the navel. Then the yogin's vital energy rising from the navel center darts upwards and penetrates the heart center. The yogin experiences it rotating the same way. Then the vital energy, continuing to rise through the central channel and reaching the throat, penetrates in a flash both the center in the throat and that located between the eyebrows, so that these too begin to spin at high speed. Such as the experiences of yogis alone. When the Kundalini of the yogin has pierced the center in the abode of Bindu between the brows, he experiences within the pulsation of prana Kundalini the rapid simultaneous rotation of all the centers from the perineal to that between the eyebrows. So that's the end of that passage. Translation by Alexis Sanderson, lightly modified by myself and also edited to make it more condensed here. Unfortunately, Swami Lakshmanju's teaching on the third aspect of Kundalini, the Para Kundalini, has not yet been translated. And so I hope to translate that and share it with you guys later. Okay, so this passage that I've read from Swami Lakshmanju is really, really profound. You know, if you just watch videos of him speaking in English, you will not get an impression of how deeply educated he really was in the tradition, because his English was simply very, very poor. So he spoke English almost in a almost like a child does, you know, but he was trying to convey complex concepts. But we see here, when he wrote in Sanskrit, that his articulation is very sophisticated. So this passage, if that was a little bit too subtle or complex seeming for you, please do read the blog post that corresponds to this video, where you can clearly see what's what in terms of this passage and the quotes that it contains. So there's a lot to potentially unpack there, and I won't attempt to unpack it in this video, but suffice to say that these three aspects of Kundalini, the first, Shakti Kundalini, is clearly associated with sexual energy in Swami Lakshmanju's analysis. And it's perhaps surprisingly described by him as having its home at the heart, coiled around the heart bindu. So whereas prana Kundalini localized, well, he doesn't actually give it a locale. He talks of it in terms of an activity. That is to say, the activity by which the fused energies of the breath, the inhale and exhale, flow down to the base and then rise up from the base, activating the chakras as they go, as the energy goes. And so this process by which Kundalini is activating these chakras in the pelvic floor, the navel, the heart, the throat, and the eyebrow center, that is the definition of prana Kundalini. It's a process rather than a thing. Of course, this is true for every aspect of Kundalini, really, right? And then the para Kundalini, presumably associated with the crown of the head, though again not actually confined there or localized there, is the one that we don't have a translation for that passage yet. Okay, so with these passages from these three different scriptures composed over the course of more than 400 years or so in the early modern and modern period, we can come to a better understanding of what the tradition of Shaiva Tantra means by the term Kundalini. And let's remember that it was this tradition of Shaiva Tantra that originated the term Kundalini in the first place. So its understanding is clearly the most important. The term, propagated into other traditions, but it was often changed. So the term was changed in the Tibetan context and in other contexts as well. Okay, so this is just another little baby step towards our understanding of Kundalini. It's a very, very deep topic. We're very far from a thorough understanding of it. But please do read the two blog posts on the subject. Links are there in the comments on the video. That's it for now. Stay tuned for more teachings and translations. Please do subscribe to the channel. And please do watch the videos all the way through. The average watch time on these YouTube videos is about 1/3 of the full length of the video. So, it's not that if you want to get a real understanding, you need to watch more than 1/3. Of course, I'm just preaching to the choir if you're hearing me say this right now. Take care, everyone, and see some of you in the global online retreat coming up in a week. Om.